December 1861. A bedroom in Lancaster, Ohio. There's a man pacing back and forth across the floor. His hands won't stop shaking. He hasn't slept in 3 days. His wife, Ellen, is terrified. She keeps watching from the doorway, wondering if he's going to hurt himself. His name is William Tecumseh Sherman. He's 41 years old, and 3 weeks ago, he was a Union general commanding troops in Kentucky. Now, the newspapers are calling him insane. His superiors have quietly removed him from command and sent him home to rest. His brother, a U.S. senator, is writing panicked letters begging the army not to officially declare him mentally unfit because it would destroy him forever. Everyone, and I mean everyone, has written him off. The consensus is clear. Sherman's military career is over. The war will go on without him. But here's what nobody expected. 4 years later, that same man, the one they said was crazy, the one suffering from what they called nervous exhaustion, would march an army of 60,000 men through the heart of the Confederacy and burn it to the ground. He would destroy everything in his path: cities, farms, railroads, the entire economic infrastructure of the South. And he would do it with such cold, methodical precision that Confederate civilians would call him the devil incarnate. Today, I want to tell you the story of how William Tecumseh Sherman went from a nervous breakdown in his family home to becoming the man who broke the South's will to fight. This isn't a story about heroism or glory. It's a story about anxiety, friendship, and the kind of ruthless logic that wins wars but haunts you forever. Because Sherman understood something that no other Union general grasped. You don't win a civil war by defeating armies. You win by making the civilians who support those armies lose hope. And that's exactly what he did.
Let me take you back to where it started. Not in 1861, but earlier. Because to understand why Sherman had a nervous breakdown, you need to understand who he was before the war. Sherman was born in Ohio in 1820. His father died when he was 9, and the family was too poor to keep all the kids. So young William was sent to live with a neighbor, Thomas Ewing, a wealthy lawyer and politician. Ewing raised him, educated him, and eventually got him an appointment to West Point. Sherman graduated in 1840, 6th in his class. Smart kid, good with numbers. But here's the thing about Sherman. He never fit in. He was anxious, restless, always worried about failure. His classmates remembered him as the guy who paced back and forth during exams, muttering to himself. After graduation, Sherman resigned from the army. He was tired of military life, tired of being passed over, tired of not making any money. So he tried business, specifically banking. He opened a branch of a St. Louis bank in San Francisco during the gold rush. And here's where people get the story wrong. Sherman actually managed that bank brilliantly during the Panic of 1857. While other banks were collapsing and bankers were fleeing with their clients' money, Sherman kept his branch solvent. He paid off every debt honestly. The parent bank in St. Louis eventually forced the closure, but Sherman's integrity during the crisis was praised by everyone who dealt with him. But here's the thing. It didn't matter. The bank still closed. Sherman felt like a failure, even though he'd done everything right. That's the kind of man he was. Even when he succeeded technically, he internalized it as failure. He tried practicing law. Failed at that too. He wasn't good at it and hated it. By 1859, Sherman was broke, humiliated, and desperate. He took a job as superintendent of a new military academy in Louisiana, what would later become Louisiana State University. It was a good job. He liked teaching. The Southern students respected him. And then, in 1861, the Civil War started. Louisiana seceded. Sherman resigned immediately. He told his Southern friends, "You people are mad. The North has all the factories, all the railroads, all the manpower. You're going to lose this war, and it's going to be a disaster." They laughed at him. Sherman went back north and offered his services to the Union Army. They made him a colonel and sent him to Kentucky to organize volunteer regiments. And that's where everything fell apart. Sherman arrived in Kentucky in October 1861, and immediately the anxiety that had been simmering inside him for decades came roaring to the surface. He was convinced the Confederates were about to invade with overwhelming force. He wasn't hallucinating or seeing things. He was overestimating enemy troop strength and seeing threats everywhere. He kept demanding more troops. He sent panic telegrams to Washington saying he needed 200,000 men to defend Kentucky. His superiors thought he was exaggerating. The press found out and started mocking him. One newspaper called him insane. Another said he was unfit for command.
Sherman started unraveling. He wasn't sleeping. He was chain-smoking cigars. He'd pace his headquarters at night, talking to himself. His staff officers were worried. His wife, Ellen, came to visit and was horrified at what she saw. And then came the final straw. On December 11, 1861, Sherman's superior officer, General Henry Halleck, quietly relieved him of command and sent him home for rest. That's military code for, "This guy's having a breakdown." The newspapers picked it up immediately. "General Sherman declared insane" was the headline in the Cincinnati commercial. The story went national. Sherman's reputation was destroyed. He went home to Lancaster, Ohio, and for weeks he barely left his room. Ellen watched him pace at night, sleepless and chain-smoking cigars. His brother John Sherman, a U.S. senator, wrote letters to military officials begging them not to officially declare his brother mentally unfit because it would ruin him forever. Sherman later said those were the darkest weeks of his life. He felt like a failure, again, like everything he'd tried to do had ended in humiliation. But here's the thing. Sherman wasn't insane. He was right. Everything he'd warned about in Kentucky, that the Confederates were planning a major offensive, that the Union was underestimating the scale of the war, that this wasn't going to be over quickly, all of it turned out to be true. But nobody believed him because he couldn't control his anxiety, because he looked unstable, because he didn't project confidence. And that taught Sherman something crucial. In war, perception matters as much as reality. You can be right about everything and still lose if people think you're crazy. He would never forget that lesson. And when he came back, and he did come back, he would never let anyone see him crack again. February 1862. Sherman has been home in Ohio for 2 months. He's still technically in the Army, but nobody's giving him a command. He's been assigned to a desk job in St. Louis, shuffling paperwork. It's humiliating. And then he gets a letter from Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was Sherman's friend from the old Army days. Not a close friend, they'd only met a few times, but they respected each other. Grant had read about Sherman's breakdown in the papers, and he didn't care. He needed good officers, and he thought Sherman was one. Grant was planning an attack on Fort Donelson in Tennessee. He asked Sherman to send him reinforcements and supplies. Sherman did, immediately, no questions asked. And when Grant captured Fort Donelson, the first major Union victory of the war, he wrote Sherman a thank you note. That small gesture meant everything to Sherman. Somebody still believed in him. A month later, Sherman got orders to report to Grant's army in Tennessee. Grant had requested him personally. Sherman was being given a second chance. When Sherman arrived at Grant's headquarters, Grant shook his hand and said, "I'm glad you're here. I need someone I can trust." That was it. No mention of the breakdown, no judgment. Just, "I need you." Sherman would remember that moment for the rest of his life. Years later, people would say of their friendship, he stood by him when he was crazy and Sherman stood by him when he was drunk. Now, that's probably not an exact quote from either man. It's more like a legend that grew up around them.
but it captures the truth of their bond perfectly. That line, "He stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk," that's one of the most famous quotes of the Civil War. And it tells you everything you need to know about their friendship.
Because Grant had his own demons. He had a reputation as a drinker. Other officers whispered that he was an alcoholic. The press accused him of being drunk at Shiloh. Grant's career was always one scandal away from collapse. But Sherman never believed it. Or if he did, he didn't care. He saw Grant the same way Grant saw him, as someone who could do the job, no matter what people said. They were both outsiders, both considered damaged goods, both written off at various points. And that created a bond between them that was unbreakable. From 1862 onward, Grant and Sherman were a team. Grant commanded the army, Sherman commanded corps and divisions under him. They trusted each other completely. Grant never questioned Sherman's loyalty or judgment. Sherman never questioned Grant's orders. And together, they started winning. April 1862, the Battle of Shiloh. This was Sherman's first real test, his first battle commanding troops in combat since his breakdown. The Confederate Army launched a surprise attack at dawn. Thousands of men came screaming out of the woods. The Union line shattered. Entire regiments ran. It was chaos. Sherman's division was hit hard, but Sherman didn't panic. He didn't freeze. He rode up and down the line, rallying his men, repositioning units, screaming orders over the gunfire. He had 2 horses shot out from under him. A bullet grazed his hand. Another tore through his hat. He didn't flinch. By the end of the first day, the Union line had been pushed back almost to the Tennessee River. It looked like a disaster. But Sherman's division held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The next day, Grant counterattacked. The Confederates retreated. The Union won. After the battle, Grant singled out Sherman in his report. He wrote, "I found Sherman, though wounded, engaged in the thickest of the fight. His conduct was brilliant." That was all Sherman needed: validation. Proof that he wasn't a failure. Proof that he could command men in battle without falling apart. From that moment on, Sherman was a different man. The self-doubt was still there. It never went away, but he learned to control it. He learned to project confidence, even when he felt none. He learned to be ruthless when ruthlessness was required. And over the next 2 years, as Grant's campaigns pushed deeper into the South, Sherman became Grant's most trusted general. When Grant was promoted to command all Union armies in 1864, he gave Sherman command of the Western Theater. Sherman was now in charge of 100,000 men and a mission: capture Atlanta, destroy the Confederate Army in Georgia, end the war. And Sherman knew exactly how to do it. Not by fighting pitched battles, not by maneuvering for territory, by breaking the South's will to resist. May 1864. Sherman begins his march toward Atlanta. The Confederate Army, commanded by General Joseph Johnston, is dug in along a series of mountain ridges in northern Georgia. Johnston's strategy is simple: make Sherman attack fortified positions, bleed his army, slow him down. But Sherman doesn't attack. He outflanks. Every time Johnston sets up a defensive line, Sherman marches around it. He forces Johnston to retreat without fighting. It's a chess match, and Sherman is always 2 moves ahead. By July, Sherman has pushed Johnston all the way back to the outskirts of Atlanta. The Confederate government is furious.
Jefferson Davis fires Johnston and replaces him with John Bell Hood, a younger, more aggressive general. Hood attacks. Sherman crushes him. 3 times in 2 weeks, Hood launches desperate assaults, and each time, Sherman's army slaughters the attackers.
By September, Atlanta is surrounded. Hood evacuates the city. Sherman's army marches in. When the news reaches the North, it's a sensation. Lincoln had been losing support. The war seemed endless. But now, Sherman had captured Atlanta, one of the most important cities in the South. The war suddenly felt winnable again. Lincoln won re-election in November largely because of Sherman's victory. People started calling Sherman a hero. But Sherman wasn't done. Capturing Atlanta was just the beginning. Now came the part that would define his legacy and divide historians for the next 160 years. Sherman proposed something radical. He wanted to abandon his supply lines, cut loose from all communication with the North, and march his army 300 miles through Georgia to the Atlantic coast. And along the way, he wanted to destroy everything. Grant was skeptical. Lincoln was terrified. Abandoning supply lines was insane. If Sherman got trapped, his entire army could be destroyed. But Sherman insisted. He said, "I can make Georgia howl." He explained his logic. The Confederate army couldn't be everywhere at once. If Sherman's army moved fast and unpredictably, there was no way to stop him. He'd march through the heartland of Georgia, destroying railroads, burning supplies, taking food and livestock, and showing Southern civilians that their government couldn't protect them. This wasn't about killing soldiers. It was about breaking morale, making the South realize the war was lost. Grant trusted him. Lincoln, reluctantly, approved. On November 15, 1864, Sherman cut the telegraph lines to Atlanta, burned the city's warehouses and railroad infrastructure, and marched his 60,000-man army into the Georgia wilderness. And for the next month, nobody in the North heard a word from him. He vanished. The Northern newspapers panicked. Had Sherman been trapped? Was his army destroyed? Lincoln paced the White House waiting for news.
But Sherman knew exactly what he was doing. Let me tell you what Sherman's march to the sea actually looked like on the ground, because the way it's taught in schools, this sanitized version where Sherman just marched through Georgia, that's not what happened. Sherman divided his army into 2 columns. They moved in parallel, about 30 miles apart, sweeping a path of destruction 60 miles wide. Here's what they did. They burned every warehouse, every mill, every factory they found. They tore up railroad tracks, heated them over bonfires, and twisted them into what they called Sherman's neckties. They couldn't be reused. They took all the food, everything. Corn, wheat, livestock, chickens, pigs. If a farm had it, Sherman's men took it. They needed it to feed the army, but they also took it to starve the South. They freed enslaved people, thousands of them. As Sherman's army moved through Georgia, formerly enslaved men, women, and children followed behind, hoping for protection and freedom. By the time Sherman reached the coast, 10,000 freed people were traveling with his army. But here's something dark that happened, something Sherman never apologized for and rarely gets mentioned. At a place called Ebenezer Creek in Georgia, one of Sherman's generals, a man named Jefferson C. Davis, yes, confusingly a Union general with that name, ordered his troops to cross a pontoon bridge. Behind them were hundreds of freed slaves who'd been following the army for protection. As soon as Davis's troops were across, he ordered the bridge dismantled, cut. The freed people were left stranded on the other side. Confederate cavalry was pursuing. Those people had no way to escape. Many drowned trying to cross the creek. Others were captured and re-enslaved or killed.
When Sherman found out, he defended Davis, said it was a military necessity, that the army couldn't be slowed down by refugees. That's the uncomfortable truth about Sherman. He would destroy slavery as a system. He'd burn the plantations, free the enslaved people. But he didn't see them as equals. He saw them as a logistical problem. And when they became inconvenient, he let them die. I'm telling you this because the story can't just be Sherman was a hero who freed the slaves. It's more complicated than that. He did free them, but he also abandoned them when it served his purpose. And they burned homes. Not all of them. Sherman's orders were to spare private homes unless there was resistance, but in practice, his soldiers burned plenty. When they encountered guerrilla attacks or sabotage, entire towns were put to the torch. Sherman didn't apologize for it. He said, "War is cruelty. There is no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over." That's Sherman's philosophy in one sentence. He believed that making war so terrible, so destructive, that people would demand it stop, that was mercy. A brutal, faster war was better than a dragged-out, civilized one. And Georgia howled, just like he said it would. Confederate civilians watched their homes burn, their food taken, their farms destroyed. They wrote letters to Jefferson Davis, begging him to stop Sherman. But Davis couldn't. There was no Confederate army large enough to stop him. Sherman moved too fast.
One Southern woman wrote in her diary, "The Yankees came through like locusts. They took everything. We have nothing left. God help us." Another wrote, "Sherman is the devil. He has destroyed us." Sherman read those letters later and felt no guilt. He said, "If the people of the South raise an army to fight us, then they are responsible for the consequences. This is what war looks like when you lose." On December 21, 1864, Sherman's army reached Savannah, Georgia. He captured the city without a fight. The Confederate defenders evacuated. Sherman sent a telegram to President Lincoln. "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." Lincoln was overjoyed. Sherman was a hero. The North went wild with celebration. But something else happened in Savannah that most people don't know about. Sherman met with black leaders, ministers, and community organizers to figure out what to do with the thousands of formerly enslaved people who'd been following his army. On January 16, 1865, Sherman issued Special Field Orders No. 15. It set aside 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land along the coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. The land would be divided into 40-acre plots and given to freed families. Each family would also receive army mules that were no longer needed. This is where the phrase 40 acres and a mule comes from. Sherman wasn't doing this out of pure humanitarian compassion. He had a practical problem. His army was moving fast, and he couldn't have tens of thousands of refugees slowing him down. But still, it was a start. It was a recognition that freedom meant nothing without economic independence. But here's the tragedy. After Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, President Andrew Johnson overturned Sherman's order. The land was given back to the former Confederate owners. The freed people were evicted. Sherman's attempt to solve the problem was erased. And for generations, that betrayal would define the failure of Reconstruction. But in December 1864, Sherman wasn't thinking about Reconstruction. He was thinking about South Carolina.
South Carolina, the state where the Civil War started, the first state to secede, the home of the fire eaters who'd been screaming for war since 1860. Sherman hated South Carolina. He blamed them for the war, and he wanted to punish them. In January 1865, Sherman's army turned north and marched into South Carolina. And this time, there was no pretense of restraint. Sherman's soldiers burned South Carolina the way locusts strip a field. Every town they passed through was torched. Columbia, the state capital, was burned to the ground. Sherman's men claimed the fires were accidental, that bales of cotton had been set on fire by retreating Confederates, and the wind spread the flames. But nobody believed that. Sherman's soldiers wanted to burn Columbia. They wanted to punish South Carolina. And they did. One soldier wrote, "The men were crying, 'This is where the war started. Burn it all.' And they did." Whether the fires started from Confederate cotton bales set ablaze by retreating troops, as Sherman claimed, or from drunken Union soldiers torching buildings, or most likely a combination of both, the result was the same. The entire city center burned. Sherman's official report blamed the Confederates and the wind. The Confederate commander, Wade Hampton, blamed Sherman's men. An official investigation later partially exonerated Sherman. There was evidence that retreating Confederates had set fire to cotton bales, and the wind was fierce that night. But here's the truth nobody disputes. Sherman's soldiers did nothing to stop the fires, and many of them helped spread them. Whether Sherman ordered it or just allowed it, Columbia burned. And he didn't lose any sleep over it. By March, Sherman had marched through South Carolina and into North Carolina. His army had destroyed over $100 million in property, billions in today's money. The South's infrastructure was in ruins. And then, on April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox. The war was over. Sherman's campaign had worked. He hadn't defeated the Confederate army in any single decisive battle. He had destroyed the South's ability and will to keep fighting. The Confederacy didn't collapse because it ran out of soldiers. It collapsed because the civilians who supported those soldiers lost hope. Sherman had shown them that their government couldn't protect them, that the war was unwinnable, and that continuing to fight would only bring more destruction. It was brutal. It was ruthless. And it worked.
After the war, Sherman became one of the most famous men in America. He was celebrated in the North as the general who ended the war. But in the South, he was hated, despised. For generations, Southern children were taught that Sherman was a war criminal, a monster, the devil in a blue uniform. Sherman didn't care about the South's opinion, but the Northern praise made him uncomfortable. In 1884, the Republican Party wanted to nominate him for president. Sherman refused. He sent them a telegram that's now famous. "I will not accept if nominated and will not serve if elected." He wanted nothing to do with politics. He said, "I'd rather be a general than president any day." Sherman spent his later years writing his memoirs and giving speeches. He was blunt, sarcastic, and unapologetic about his conduct during the war. When people criticized his march to the sea, he said, "War is hell. You cannot qualify it in harsher terms than I will. But when you men appeal to force, when you call for the sword, you must bear the consequences." He also said, "I am tired of hearing about this honorable warfare. There is no such thing. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it." That was Sherman. No euphemisms, no romantic notions, just cold, hard truth. Sherman died in 1891 at the age of 71. His funeral in New York City was attended by thousands, including his old friend Joseph Johnston, the Confederate general he'd outmaneuvered in Georgia. Johnston served as a pallbearer. It was a cold, rainy day, and someone suggested Johnston put on a hat. He refused. He said, "If I were in Sherman's place, and he were standing in mine, he would not put on his hat." Johnston caught pneumonia at the funeral. He died a month later. That story tells you everything about how even his enemies respected Sherman. They hated what he did, but they couldn't deny that he was brilliant. But Sherman's story doesn't end with the Civil War. And this is the part that shows his philosophy wasn't just about the South. It was his fundamental view of how to wage war. After the war, Sherman became General of the Army, the highest-ranking officer in the United States military. And in the 1870s and 1880s, the U.S. Army was fighting the Indian Wars in the West. Sherman applied the exact same strategy he'd used in Georgia. Total war. Destroy the enemy's ability to sustain themselves.
The Plains Indians depended on buffalo for food, clothing, shelter, everything. So, Sherman supported and encouraged the wholesale slaughter of the buffalo herds. He said, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." By 1890, the buffalo were nearly extinct. The Plains tribes were starving, broken, and confined to reservations. Sherman's march to the sea philosophy, destroy the enemy's resources, break their will to resist, was applied to Native Americans with devastating effect. I'm telling you this because you need to understand Sherman wasn't just a Civil War general who made hard choices to save the Union. He was a man who believed that total war, the complete destruction of an enemy's society, was the most effective way to win. And he applied that belief consistently against the Confederacy, against Native Americans, anywhere he believed force was necessary. Was he effective? Yes, absolutely. He won his wars. But at what cost? That's the question history still argues about. So, was Sherman a madman or a genius? The honest answer? He was both. Sherman was a deeply anxious, neurotic man who had a nervous breakdown in 1861 and was declared insane by the newspapers. That part is true. He struggled with mental health his entire life. But he was also one of the most strategic minds in American military history. He understood modern warfare in a way that almost no one else did. He saw that in a total war, a war where the entire society is mobilized, you don't just fight the army. You fight the economy, the infrastructure, the morale of the civilian population. Sherman didn't invent total war, but he perfected it. And the reason he could do what he did, the reason he could march through Georgia burning everything in his path without hesitation, is because he'd already been to hell. He'd sat in that hospital room in Ohio in 1861, shaking and terrified, convinced his life was over. He'd been mocked, humiliated, written off as a failure. He'd hit bottom. And when you've already been to your darkest place, when you've already faced your own collapse, you stop being afraid of what people think. You stop worrying about being liked or respected. You just do what needs to be done. That's what made Sherman dangerous. He didn't care about glory. He didn't care about his reputation in the South. He cared about ending the war as quickly as possible, and he was willing to be hated for it. Grant understood this. That's why he trusted Sherman with the march to the sea. Grant knew Sherman wouldn't flinch, wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't let public opinion or moral hand-wringing stop him from doing what was necessary. And Sherman didn't. He marched through Georgia, burned it, and broke the South's will. And the war ended. Was it cruel? Yes. Sherman admitted it. He said war is cruelty. You cannot refine it. Was it effective? Absolutely. Sherman's campaign shortened the war, saved lives in the long run, made it clear to the Confederacy that continuing to fight was pointless. That's the question historians still argue about. Some say Sherman was a war criminal who targeted civilians and committed atrocities.
Others say he was a military genius who understood that winning a civil war required breaking the enemy's will, not just defeating their army. I think the truth is more complicated. Sherman wasn't a monster. He didn't enjoy burning homes or making civilians suffer, but he believed it was necessary. He believed that making the war so terrible that people couldn't endure it was the fastest way to peace. And he was probably right. The march to the sea ended the war. Without it, the fighting could have dragged on for years. More soldiers would have died. More families would have been destroyed. Sherman chose the brutal path because he thought it was the merciful one, a short, terrible war instead of a long, grinding one. Whether you agree with that or not, you have to respect the logic and the courage it took to make that choice, knowing he'd be hated for it. Let me leave you with one last story, because I think it shows who Sherman really was. In 1879, Sherman was invited to give a speech at a military academy. The cadets were expecting a rousing speech about honor, duty, and the glory of war. Instead, Sherman walked to the podium and said this: "I've been where you are now, and I know what's before you. War is hell. There is no sense in trying to make it anything else. The only way to make war is to make it so terrible that people will not endure it." He paused. The room was silent. Then he said, "I am tired of hearing about the glories of war. There are no glories, only suffering, death, and grief. If you want my advice, stay out of it if you can. But if you must fight, fight to win. Fight so that it ends quickly. Because every day it continues, more boys die." That's Sherman. No romanticizing, no speeches about duty and honor. Just the cold, hard truth. And maybe that's why they called him insane, because he told people what they didn't want to hear. He said war was hell when everyone else was calling it glorious. He said victory required cruelty when everyone else wanted to believe in honorable combat. But he was right. And when the chips were down, when the war needed to be won, they gave the job to Sherman, the man they'd called crazy. Because crazy or not, he got it done. So here's what I want you to take away from this. Sherman's story isn't just about the Civil War. It's about how we judge people, how we write them off when they don't fit the mold, how we call someone insane when they see things we don't want to see.
In 1861, Sherman was sent home from Kentucky suffering from what they called nervous exhaustion, what we'd probably call severe anxiety and depression today. He predicted the war would be long, brutal, and required total commitment. He was right, but nobody believed him. In 1864, Sherman said the only way to end the war was to destroy the South's ability to fight. He was right, but people called him a monster. Sherman spent his whole life being right about uncomfortable truths, and he paid the price for it. He was mocked, dismissed, hated. But he also won the war. If this story changed the way you think about leadership, about mental health, about what it takes to make hard decisions, then I've done my job. Sherman's life teaches us that the people who see things clearly are often the ones who get called crazy, and the people who are willing to do what is necessary are often the ones who get hated for it. But history remembers who won. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the uncomfortable truths of history, because I'm going to keep telling you the stories they don't teach in school, the ones that show you how power actually works, the ones that make you rethink everything you thought you knew. And let me know in the comments, do you think Sherman was a war criminal or a military genius? Was the march to the sea justified? Let's talk about it. I'll see you in the next one.